Hello and welcome to AZ Community Roundtable. My name is James Cook and I'll be your host. I would like to welcome everyone who could join today. The purpose of this show is to casually talk about Azure. Anything's on the table, news, blogs, all features can be discussed. A quick introduction before we move on to our guests. I've worked in tech over 10 years, 8 years at a not-for-profit organisation where I progressed in my role, and when I left as a technical architect working with Microsoft, Apple and Google products. I currently work at a fintech organisation implementing and managing infrastructure solutions including Azure, and over the last month I have become a Microsoft Servers trainer. Now I'll move on and let my guest speakers introduce themselves. Chris and Martin. We'll let Chris introduce himself first.
I've been in the cloud space for the past 8 years or so now in various forms, working in kind of different areas, whether it's infrastructure focused or application focused. I haven't personally gone so much on the data side personally, but app dev and infra, I've played a lot around there. So looking forward to joining in the discussion today with everyone. That's me.
I'll let Martin introduce himself now.
Yeah, I'm Martin Terkelsen. I'm working as a cloud solutions specialist in Denmark at a company called Azure. I've been in the industry for about 20 years now, and that's a bit scary saying it out loud, but it's quite a long time. Been focusing a lot on automation, cloud solutions, and so on for the last 3 or 4 years. Also member of the Citrix CDP program. So blogging and writing, helping others out is something I enjoy and spend my evenings doing. I have a few blogs where I write on Citrix stuff and of course on cloud automation stuff as well. I think that's been me.
Thank you both. Brilliant introductions. So we'll go on to the first talking point. We had MS Build last week. I take you and Martin and Chris may have tuned in. I know especially Chris has, because I've seen some of his blog posts in the last few days. And he actually brings on to one of the talking points I have, which is about the announced Azure application services that can now run on outside of Azure, so on Kubernetes really. So that's I think the example that was given was web applications such as app service, Azure functions, logic apps, event grid and API management can now run on Kubernetes that are on on-prem, AWS, Google Cloud, and it just opens up that ability for developers yet to put those applications now on other platforms. I don't know what you guys thought that news really. For me, it was a great eye opener that Microsoft is literally going to their customers, going, feel free to develop and also put those services out on other platforms.
Yeah. I think you've covered it nicely there, James. I think it is just such a big shift for something that sounds like a small announcement. You know, we're able to now deploy this thing on an additional platform. The possibilities it starts unlocking is huge. And I think to take a step back a sec, from a Kubernetes perspective, you know, we've been able to run containers on multiple platforms for quite some time now. You know, I think the industry has grown to the concept of containers and Kubernetes as one of the orchestrators that can do that. But if you think about like the application layer on top of that, it's been a little more of a difficult discussion because, you know, a container is a container. It could contain anything effectively. But when you think about something like app service, where you've got this opinionated deployment model, you've got all these features that wrap around it, for example, like you've got deployment, I can't think of the words right now, but all these different features anyway that app services gives you. That ability now to take all of that investment that has been made in Azure and use that in AWS or GCP or on premises, wherever you're running your Kubernetes cluster, I think is a huge announcement. So As you mentioned, I've been writing a ton of blog posts on it this week. That's something I'm super, super excited about. So big announcement for sure.
Totally agree on that one. We've been using Azure Functions as well, where we work at the moment, and being able to spread that workload around in other clouds. So we are talking hybrid clouds instead of just the Azure cloud. That's a huge benefit, and also like you said, that the developers can actually do this themselves now. So it's not forcing them to actually learn some new infrastructure. They can learn how to deploy Kubernetes, and that's about it. Use the containers where you want.
And I think that's the point, isn't it? Is so often when new technology comes out, we have to go and relearn something. We have to go and skill up in a different area. Whereas because of that base level of containers making everything consistent, Kubernetes is that orchestrator which makes it super easy for us to go and orchestrate and manage at scale, which is great. But now there's these scenarios where teams like the Azure engineering teams can come along and make these consistent application deployment scenarios across all these platforms. That's something I'm super clear on whenever I'm talking to folks, is that Kubernetes is a platform for building platforms. If you're just using it for applications, it might be a bit overkill depending upon the scale. But when you start bundling things like this into the mix with Azure Arc, I'm really excited about it. I think it definitely opens up a lot of new opportunities for sure.
And the Zero Arc idea was another thing that was like an eye-opener, being able to use that, what I think Microsoft describes it as a single pane of glass, being able to control those Kubernetes clusters in other environments and being able to just deploy through that one interface. Again, that's just makes it so much easier for developers just to learn one interface and being able to just go to one place to manage those multiple environments, and then again, with it being on, like you say, Chris, on Kubernetes, it's not another thing to learn. It's literally it's already there. People's got that knowledge. They don't have to retrain or anything. It's just expanding your cluster onto different platforms, and that's it really. It's amazing. For me, I listened to the announcement. I was like, this is literally where developers want to be right now. And for me as an infrastructure person, it was like, yep, that's what I would want for developers to have. Me being able to help them set up on different platforms, on-prem, AWS, Google Cloud, and being able to say to them, here you go, use your Kubernetes. This is your Kubernetes cluster, and this is your single interface to manage those containers. So, yeah, I have to say, Microsoft pat on the back, really. And the only other thing I was thinking about was the actual code side of things, being able to manage this. And it's a little bit of another infrastructure as code like question that we might bring up later, but using the tool for that, of course this has came out only recently, and there's all support for infrastructure as code, and everything in regards to Kubernetes, but being choosing the right coding solution is going to be another thing to consider now when looking at managing your Microsoft Kubernetes cluster in one platform and then going off and deploying somewhere else in AWS. So it's another thing that we need to now consider, choosing the right product and for that type of stuff, as well as PowerShell, CLI and stuff, Azure CLI. It's another consideration when we are looking at moving these services to another solution, a cloud provider. So I don't know what you guys think about that.
Let Martin go first. There you go.
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about now, because I've been using Azure for just about everything I'm doing in the cloud. I've been doing a bit of ABS, but now when we need to deploy on multi-cloud as well, we need to think of the right tools and the right coding language. So where we might have used Azure CLI before to do some of the deployments there. We maybe should be moving into a new tool, or another tool like Terraform or Ansible or whatever, or just regular PowerShell. And I think one of Chris's points later on is actually choosing the right tool as well. So we can also talk pipelines and so on if you're using Jenkins or Azure DevOps or GitHub. So there's definitely a lot going on the infrastructure side here. So maybe we as infrastructure consultants, that's my main focus as well. We have a bit of more learning to do, so we can set the developers free to actually do their stuff more productively. But I see it as a fun thing, something I'm looking forward to and looking more into. So definitely something I look forward to.
Yeah, completely echo those comments. I think infrastructure as code is definitely the space that has grown over the past 4 years or so. I think, I've been talking about it for at least that amount of time, and I think I'm hearing a lot more people talking about it these days compared to back then. And I think the point about things like Terraform or Pulumi, where you've got almost, I wouldn't say agnostic, that's kind of the wrong word, but I think neutral, as you put it, was a great way. Because something like Terraform, it's not like you write it once and you can deploy it to any environment like an AWS or a GCP or Azure. You've got to write it for each individual specific platform. The framework is consistent. The way you write the code is consistent, but you still have to hook into a specific provider. But I think the benefit of something like, and I'm sure we'll come to this later, right? But maybe a bit of a hook for now is something like Terraform is desired state versus something like PowerShell, which is more imperative. And I think when you get into that scenario where you're thinking about on-premises, where you're thinking about multiple clouds, do you really want to be in the scenario where you've got to go ahead imperatively through your PowerShell code, figuring out if this scenario happens, then do this, or if this case happens, do this, and try and make that generic across 4 or 5 different hosting environments? Probably not, at least in my opinion. I'd rather offload that to some kind of tool to do that for me and have it desired state. So
I think
I
think it really comes down to the customer or the business you work for. I've always had this discussion about the multi-cloud topic. Where should you put all your eggs in one basket? Is the question, and a lot of people go, well, if you've got multi-region support, so zero redundancy and everything, why wouldn't you stick with one cloud provider? But I think we've had this experience in the last year or two, where sticking with one cloud provider can sometimes cause some issues, and this is where the talk, I've seen few news articles coming out from people about talking about, I think the wording is cloud platform redundancy now. So being able to have that multi-cloud environment, to then be able to support if say AWS or Google Cloud or Azure goes down, being able to load balance your traffic over to another provider, and definitely with the web application that Azure has allowed to be now multi-platform, it does gives that cloud platform redundancy more of a talking point now in the community. Why would you do it, and why wouldn't you do it? Like you say, Chris, why would you start learning more than one cloud platform? It's more overhead, more costly, for training people, individuals, or recruiting more knowledge in people, to be able to support that. It's going to be, I think, over the next few months, I think it's going to be a big topic around why would you want to do it, what's the problems that could occur when doing this in regards to not just technically but also knowledge sharing and other things, really. So I think this space and this talk will extend for the next few months and into the future, really. I don't think we've got any questions out on Twitter at the moment, but I'm more than happy to move on if you guys are happy, and move on to Martin's topic of choice, and I think I touched a little bit on it, but I think it built up the conversation well, really.
Yeah, it does actually, because the topic I brought to the table is actually infrastructure as code, and not in the sense that we need to choose a tool, because we're going to talk to that about that anyway. But we've seen more and more traction right on the public clouds and moving there, that especially in Azure in Denmark at least. And basically all the time as a consultant, we get the question, how do we get started, and what's important when we're going to move workloads and services to the cloud? And what we've been seeing is that the use of infrastructure as code just makes the services and installations more reliable, more traceable, and actually easier just to maintain and understand for the customers as well. But they're kind of scared in the beginning, because it's a big change for them, and they used VMware or Hyper-V on location and just use templates and then manually installing all the software afterwards. And that's been working for them for a long time, and it could still be working actually in Azure as well. But we just see that when they start using infrastructure as code, that they trust the platform more. They know they can go back in time if they use the pipelines and so on, and source code and source versioning. And that's one of the talking points. I want to get some feedback from you guys as well. Are you seeing the same as we're doing here in Denmark, where infrastructure as code is getting traction now and is getting talk time at customers?
I think it's one of these things. I started learning Azure properly as a certification path at the beginning, like January last year. And when I started learning it, I was doing the fundamentals and I built onto the administration. But once I started learning the administration, I started learning more about infrastructure as code. And I moved on to, at the time, there was a couple of products, but nothing of as big as HashiCorp Terraform. And that's the one I started learning, and that's the one that I started to play around with. Some open projects from GitHub. I started playing around with being able to deploy stuff into Azure and learning how that all connects with state-based, and so on and so forth. And literally, I've been now advocating the use of infrastructure as code in our company, not just in Azure, but also as a on-prem tool to be able to go, okay, we should be using this to identify state-based stuff, and being able to destroy and rebuild infrastructure. And I think it's literally growing, and Microsoft have been working on tools the last thing about over a year now, and I know in the last couple of months, Bicep, which is a Microsoft project, and I think it is open source as well, because a lot of people are committing to developing it, is getting traction, and it's getting a lot of popularity around with Microsoft employees, as well as certified trainers, MVPs. They're all talking about it on Twitter. So and I've seen a lot of good work. It's very like Terraform, but there's a few more advanced features you can get from it. And and then there's more products like Pulumi, and I'm trying to remember the other ones, but they're the big ones I know about. And I think this is I think it's no way around it. We are now in over the last few years are moving infrastructure more into a developer mindset. So we are thinking the way of a developer. We code to implement infrastructure, especially when it comes to cloud. The physical side of hardware and web UI implementation is, I would say, dissolving. That skill set is still needed for a lot of things, but infrastructure as code is now a factor in making decisions when you are looking at deploying resources into virtual environments, including cloud. So
yeah, absolutely, I agree with all of that. I think when we boil infrastructure as code down, it really comes back to DevOps principles, right? it's all about consistency. It's all about making sure that we can do the things that we need to do in an automated way. And I think until, we've always had PowerShell, or it feels like anyway, we've always had PowerShell. We've got Azure CLI, we've got, CLIs for individual cloud providers, and it's kind of fragmented in that sense. I think something like Terraform is great, where you can go and start standardizing on a consistent framework. Bicep again is great in the sense that it's evolving the ARM template language, the Azure Resource Manager template language that is there, making it a lot simpler to understand. I think that was some very common feedback when comparing to Terraform, for example. And I think overall, it's just going to make that process of deployment easier. Is it necessarily the first step people should do when they're on their cloud journey? Probably not. I think you need to kind of nail some of the cloud concepts down first. And for a lot of people, that is just using the portals and understanding how some of these services work, some of the things you need to configure there. But then as you start going through and thinking, right, we want to move towards production, I think what we're seeing, or rather what I'm seeing at least anyway, is a lot of organizations moving away from that world where, it's less about individuals going ahead and having the right access permissions and whatnot to go and deploy things, but starting to build pipelines around those infrastructure as code deployments. So rather than me as Chris having the permissions to create the resources in the subscription and manage it that way, I put it all as code into maybe a Git repository or whatever repository, have a pipeline which triggers when there's a change to validate some tests, checks that all out, and goes ahead and pushes that out to the cloud. And there's a few benefits to that, which I would just want to pull out a bit more, because I think there's a few nuances, and it's picking up on the point, James, you mentioned earlier about effectively becoming more like developers. When you think about infrastructure as code, it's infrastructure development. When you think about application code, app development. When you think about automated database deployments, that's data development. When you think about machine learning and data scientists, they've all got notebooks and codes and stuff in GitHub or Git or wherever it may be. And I think we really are seeing that shift to everything as code. And infrastructure as code is one big part of that, which I think is crucial to really running projects at scale on the cloud. Do we all want to be in the state of operating and trying to track what deployments we've got going where manually? I think the way that we need to do that and be successful is through infrastructure as code. So big fan and agree with everything you've both said.
I actually started sneaking infrastructure as code in with several of the customers when we were talking Azure startups, and just they're going to remove a test environment and so on into Azure. And I'm just sneaking in infrastructure in as code, because just sneaking in NSG rules or firewall rules and so on, using those as code makes sense even to those who's not fond of infrastructure as code, because they can actually move back in their firewall rule and NSG rule afterwards, and they can see the benefits of that. And using in that entry point to talking to the operations guys that's not very fond of it, actually starts using the tools as well and the mindset. And next time I need to talk to them applying a new service with new virtual machines or app services and so on, then it's not that hard to convince them to actually use infrastructure as code again, because now they're used to using it with firewall rules, which they can relate to. So that's one of the points I've learned, that if we can actually start to find a point that the operations guys are used to using it as code, because they're using Cisco firewalls with the CLI and SSH and so on, that can be moved forward.
And there's a great point in that as well. You mentioned about, I think it was network security groups or firewall rules. Yeah. And when you think about certain industries where they have loads of compliance rules that they need to go and hit, for example, or demonstrate certain things, maybe even not that, maybe even just understanding what the current state looks like. The great benefit of infrastructure as code is that it is self-documenting, because it's all code. So you don't need to go and figure out who made the change to the firewalls that suddenly let our APIs loose and everyone can call them directly. You can go and check that, for example, in who made the commits if you need to go and do that. All of those commits can obviously have reasons associated behind them if you need to go and do that. But the real value is that actually everything is self-documenting. So if you need to go and see what the current state of the infrastructure should look like, because things like ARM templates and Terraform, for example, are all desired state configuration, you can see what the state of the environment should be at that point in time. And if you are just controlling that entire environment through a pipeline, rather than letting people individually update, create, delete resources, then that should be the state of the environment. And that's a huge benefit that I think sometimes I certainly take for granted, but actually is quite a big point to make there.
Yeah, and I think another thing to remember with infrastructure as code, there's a lot of third-party tools coming out in regards to static code analysis. I've done a couple blog posts on that topic now, where being able to scan the code before you deploy it and being able to find vulnerabilities or configuration incorrectness is powerful. It's been when I've been speaking to other people, it's been an eye-opener being able to go, oh, there's something wrong with my code, which means there's going to be something wrong with my infrastructure when I deploy it. So being able to work, I think if they say it's not work backwards, work more left, I think the saying is, but being able to work, identify before you deploy, it's amazing, rather than having a user being able to implement something and by user error implement a vulnerability or a security risk and not being able to identify that without having an audit done on your environment after you've implemented the infrastructure. It's one of those another developer type stance here, where developer code has static code analysis and is identified before they deploy the application. What have I coded? Is there a secret that shouldn't be in clear text format and should be encrypted? That philosophy being applied to infrastructure is very strong, and when you talk to customers or fellow colleagues about, oh, you're able to do this before you build, it's an eye-opener going, well, for a security perspective, this is amazing. And I spoke to, when we speak to our InfoSec team internally in my company, it's like, this is the way we want to go, because we'd be able to look at those reports from static code analysis tools to then go, that ISC has either changed because it's now detecting a change in when applying the infrastructure changes, or the static code analysis has come back here with there's a clear password. You can't, with like in the pipeline in a pull request or whatever, being able to then flag it to say you can't merge it with a commit or deploy to an environment because it's got that vulnerability. It's a game changer.
Definitely. We see that as well in all the pre-checks, and then if you're using PowerShell, using pester test in the pipelines as well. It's just so valuable for both us as a consultant, but also for internal companies starting to use this as well. So we definitely see attraction on that side as well. And also one of the reasons we get the questions is, what can we do about security in public clouds? Because of course that's a hot topic for everyone. So this is something that helps them as well.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, I think we'll move on to Chris now, because it moves on to another relatable topic, which is, I'll let him explain it to you.
Absolutely. Thanks, James. So I guess the topic I wanted to bring along to the table was different DevOps tools, really. I think over my time working with organizations, I've always been customer facing, so almost always in this kind of consultative engineering facing role, I guess, and facing outwards to customers. And I guess some of the things that I wanted to bring to the table were really, of course, there's an elephant in the room about Azure DevOps and GitHub, and I know it's on a lot of people's minds, so I wanted to bring that one to the table and discuss that a little bit here. But also just maybe talk a bit around what you folks are seeing as well in terms of DevOps tools. Like, one of the ways I commonly describe some of the setups that I see is almost like a Frankenstein DevOps approach, where you've got loads of different tools to go and hook together the version control, the build pipeline, the release pipeline, and maybe static code analysis and container image scanning and all the different tools, right? You've got every single one of them. So We can come maybe back to the Azure DevOps and GitHub discussion in a moment, but maybe let's start off with just the types of things you're seeing people use in the wild and what yourselves are using as well.
Well, if I start on that one, we are mostly using Azure DevOps today and trying to use that as much as possible. So the broadest range of the tools they provide in that one. So we are using the GitHub repos, of course, in Azure DevOps. We are using boards to control our workflows and our work items, and trying to couple those into the actually commits and so on we're doing inside of Azure DevOps. That's the primary tool we're using. Of course, we're seeing some GitHub as well, but it's not much yet. But as you show, let's get into that discussion later on. What's getting moved in there? But the wiki, all for documentation, the boards for all the work items, and the pipelines for both releases and builds, and scanning whatever we can for making our code deployments as secure as possible.
I think for me personally, my company has used quite a handful of DevOps products, I should say. I came in a couple of years ago, and the transition from Jenkins to Azure DevOps was happening. So for me, seeing that transformation, I find it with most products they're quite similar in DevOps. It's the bigger names like Azure DevOps and GitHub seem to bring more to the table, just purely because they got more of a customer base. So I know personally, from my personal opinion, I like Azure DevOps. I use a lot with Azure DevOps. I build all my pipelines for it for personal and work projects and so on and so forth. But when it comes to my preferred DevOps tool would be GitHub. I started learning more about GitHub once they started introducing GitHub Actions, and being able to do what I can do in Azure DevOps and GitHub seems to be a no-brainer. The community around GitHub is bigger. There's a lot of open source projects to work on, and again, you can fork these repos and put them into Azure DevOps and everything, but being able to have that documented platform from GitHub and everything, and having all that knowledge shared online, there's so much more than any other platform. And being able to go, okay, well, my preferred platform would be GitHub, is purely because it brings all the functions like Azure DevOps, and that's the one I would recommend. It's one that I'm trying to advocate in the company to go, come on, let's make the switch, let's be brave and let's go GitHub. But it's not as easy as that. As you guys probably are aware, you can't just pick up a product and move it across your pipelines and everything, because it doesn't just work that way. But yeah, it's they're the primary two, Azure DevOps and GitHub. But I have experienced Jenkins, which again, it's a very strong product and a big customer base. But in comparison, it's definitely not as big as the customer base. And I keep saying customer base, but I would say fan base more. There's a lot of fan people around that content, so there's a lot more documented information on there. So
yeah, gotcha. And I think there's a few interesting points that you both said in there, just to pull those out a bit here. The number one is going to be, something like GitHub or Azure DevOps. I think you mentioned this, James, that is almost like the full suite of products from a DevOps tooling perspective that you'd need. So going from planning all the way to coding, through to build, release, and everything in between, right? Whereas there are tools like Jenkins or Jira or all of these other ones that we've heard of in the wild that do a job really well, but then you might have to plug that in with some kind of other tool, or somewhere along the way, as technical leadership has changed in an organization, different tools have come along, and then you get this Frankenstein kind of architecture for a DevOps platform that I mentioned earlier. But I think, as you say, GitHub and Azure DevOps are both almost this full suite of products. And I think that sometimes makes it a little bit challenging because, of course, now both Azure DevOps and GitHub are owned by Microsoft, which is the right tool, which is the one that you should go for. That's often I see a question asked when I'm doing some of my community talks and when I'm discussing with folks. And you nailed it when you said a bit earlier there, James, that you need to pick the right tool, and you need to evaluate, and you can't just shift over because there's another tool there, right? It's not necessarily the right thing to do. And I think that's the exact same recommendation from a Azure DevOps versus GitHub perspective as well, because there are certain things that Azure DevOps does really well. There are certain things that GitHub does really well. So for example, when you think about those enterprise scenarios where you need super, super duper granular role-based access control, or maybe you need to have your code hosted in a specific region, for example. Well, GitHub isn't quite there yet with some of those things. Like when you create your Azure DevOps organization, you have to pick a region where that Azure DevOps organization is going to be deployed. You don't really have that concept with GitHub. When you think about the permissions control you have, yes, you have roles and some level of permissions inside of GitHub, but it's not quite as granular as Azure DevOps because it's been brought up from that level with something like Team Foundation Server, where it originated from. But on the flip side, GitHub is, of course, probably the world's biggest platform from an open source perspective, and that's really where GitHub originated, right? So when you think about that social experience of coding and developing with other folks, it's brilliant from that perspective. And you mentioned GitHub Actions. I'm such a huge fan of GitHub Actions, and I'm probably going to stop talking in a moment because I could go on for ages talking about GitHub Actions and how much I love it. But there are some really brilliant features in GitHub, and I think like I say, it's not just a case of we need to use either GitHub or Azure DevOps. Coming back to the point Martin made earlier, you can absolutely use both with each other. Why not use Azure Boards? Because it has a lot more, enterprise feel that you need from a managing your backlogs and your processes, for example, compared with GitHub issues. Why not use GitHub repos because you want that social coding experience, but then use Azure pipelines because you need more granular control than what's in GitHub Actions today. And it's all pluggable in that way. So I think they are a great combination that you could use together, to be honest.
And they've been a combination for a while before Actions. You used to be using GitHub for the repository side, and then pushing off anything in regards to pipelines, off to Azure DevOps. So they're always coincided. And when Microsoft purchased it and everything, that build has gone over to GitHub, and GitHub's features gone over to Azure DevOps. We have seen that and everything. I think I've been one of those people. I think last year at Ignite when I started seeing a lot of talk at a Ignite event, and it's all around GitHub. And I think it was the same again with this year's Ignite and MS Build. There's a lot of talk about GitHub, and there's a lot of downplay about Azure DevOps and that. And I think that's one of the things you've had a lot of customers see from that perspective. You're not being able to see, there's not a lot of work going on Azure DevOps, it doesn't seem like. So is GitHub going to be the replacement, and Azure DevOps going to be deprecated in couple of years time or a year's time? So do we start considering it now? And I think this MS Build, I think that talk did come up, and I think a lot of Microsoft employees from the Azure DevOps teams came out going, no, we've all these all that's been announced and everything, in the background. These features are coming out here and there and everywhere, but it's just not been highlighted at these events. And I think that's a very a bad approach here by Microsoft, not to talk about Azure DevOps along with GitHub. I think they both have to have the same stage presence if you want to give customers the reassurance that both products are here to work together, or or something like that. Because at the moment it just looks like, oh, we're going to go ahead and just use GitHub in the end, because we're just talking about GitHub. Just move over, because all we're talking about is GitHub. But actually, in the background, there is a lot of R&D work and releases been happening for Azure DevOps.
Yeah, there's been a bit, I would say, on the Azure DevOps. Not as much as we are hearing on the GitHub side. I think I actually read at some point that most of the developers for Azure DevOps was being moved to GitHub. Not sure if that's correct or not, but maybe Microsoft can comment on that later on.
I think, I think I've read the same thing. I think it was after the MS build or something. I read something. Yeah, they said, "Oh, Azure DevOps is going to GitHub," and I went to myself, "Where's this news? Where's this news article came from?" And literally, I couldn't find nothing in regards to it being fact. But yeah, that's what social media is about, ain't it? A bit of gossip.
Definitely. So there's a lot of stuff I love about the Azure DevOps part of it, with all the work items and so on, being able to trace my work. And as Chris said, you can actually couple those things together with GitHub, so you can do all your work items relations just by tagging your commits and so on. So you actually get the same experience that you would at a native Azure DevOps experience. You can move that into the GitHub and use the actions or the pipelines, whatever you need, feel the need for. So I'm definitely a GitHub fan as well. I'm using GitHub for my personal stuff. At work, we're using DevOps because that's more customer friendly, I think, because they can control all the stuff in the same portal and not having to shift. If GitHub was to get some of the work control as well inside of that, maybe I would consider moving customers in there full. But we're not quite there yet, so DevOps still has a place, I think.
I think, yeah, like you say, it's missing that that Azure AD integration, being able to use those credentials from Microsoft and controlling those in your organization. I haven't seen that. I don't think that exists. I could be completely wrong, but
it does.
It does.
If you have GitHub Enterprise, you can actually couple it together with the integration ID.
There you go. I'm bull that.
You have to license everyone. Yeah, you have to license every user in there. So if you have 200 users or 2,000 users in your AD, you have to license everyone.
And I think this is where things get interesting with GitHub is, you've got github.com, which is what a lot of people think of when they think of GitHub. Then you've got GitHub Enterprise Server, which is a bit like Azure DevOps Server, where you can go ahead and kind of host your own instance of an Azure DevOps or host your own instance of a GitHub on a virtual machine as an appliance. And exactly as Martin said, that AD integration is there. It is possible. It'll be interesting to see if/what happens with GitHub and whether it gets that as a kind of a cloud service like Azure DevOps is today. But I think what I do like about GitHub, and I say this a lot in my own talks and things that I do as well, is bring it back actually to the infrastructure as code point and bringing security into pipelines. They're focusing a ton on DevSecOps. So GitHub last year acquired a company called Semel. And Semel, for anyone who doesn't know, you may have heard of projects like Dependabot, you may have heard of CodeQL, for example. These are all tools that effectively help you bring security, shift it left away from that kind of operational state early on into the development cycle. So then you can go and scan your code, for example, for potential paths which lead to vulnerabilities. You can go ahead and automatically go and upgrade your versions of your packages, for example, or even get notified and alerted and have a pull request automatically created if there is a package with a security vulnerability in your environment, for example. And I think that's where, when you start looking at Azure DevOps and GitHub, that's where some of the great pieces come together, because you've got boards, for example, in Azure DevOps that are enterprise in nature. They've been there, they've been tried and tested, and they work really well. But then you've got some of this innovation, as we were kind of alluding to earlier, GitHub code spaces, for example, as well, all focused around the repos inside of GitHub. So absolutely a kind of best of both discussion, I think, to get the value from each there. But exciting times ahead in the DevOps space. It's never been a better time to be a DevOps enthusiast, I think.
Yeah, it's something I really am interested in myself personally on the infrastructure side, yeah, DevOps and everything, yeah, because of the culture change here for infrastructure. It's more going towards that DevOps approach, and yeah, definitely, yeah, it is going to be an interesting few years ahead of us. It has changed in the last, even the last few months. Yeah, it's just it keeps evolving, and more comes out of it, and definitely I can see. And over the next couple of years, that a more of a DevOps approach here will come across, and that a bit that ethos, will be picked up by infrastructure people and developer people, security, and it just merge into that particular a team, for say, or that ethos, that ability of DevOps being integrated into people's day-to-day work. Just okay, we're going to do this, and we'll think about DevOps approach, and we'll do that, and that's how I think that we're going to see the next couple of years is going to be like. So it's going to be a very interesting time for all of us in the cloud and infrastructure and development world, really. So okay. I don't know if you guys got any other points or questions before we end it.
No, I don't think from me. I think it's been a good discussion. Enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, same for me. I enjoyed it.
Brilliant, great to hear. So just one final point. Yeah, I've noticed on Twitter that a lot of people are congratulating each other for their MVPs. So I'd like to say well done to all those who received their MVPs as I think it's like every first of the month. So congratulations. Your content is well received, especially from myself. Yeah, I read a lot of content and I see a lot of material from on YouTube and on individual platforms. So thank you. I wanted to make sure that was on this podcast. So I'd like to thank my guests, Chris and Martin, for joining me today for talking Azure. And I hope to speak to you all soon on our next show in a couple of weeks' time. We will announce the speakers then. Bye-bye.